Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on generative AI in the legal sector. We are just past 4 p.m. here in European Central Time, so we are going to just dive right in it. I hope you can all hear me okay. If not, you have a chat function to the right of your screen that you should be able to ask any questions and make any comments. So, I'll start by quickly introducing the speakers for today, which is my colleague Maarten and myself. We are the two co-founders of ClauseBase. We are both former big law lawyers from an international law firm, and we founded ClauseBase in 2019. But that's enough about us. Before we officially kick things off, I just wanted to say that you are welcome to share any questions you may have during the presentation in the Q&A menu. We'll address as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. But regardless, this webinar is being recorded. So if we do go over time and a bit and you have a hard stop, just know that we will be sharing the recording straight after. So without further ado, Maarten, take it away.
All right, thank you, Senne. Let's start by setting the scene. So we wanted to organize this webinar because we are seeing such excitement around generative AI and Gen AI in the legal sector. And as vendors, it is such a pleasant change of pace to see that lawyers of all walks of life start to embrace this technology. We've been in the sector for years now, and so we're happy to share all the knowledge that we have ourselves built up. This means that a lot of people are still dipping their toes in the water, and with that, of course, comes a lot of information lacking and on how generative AI works exactly. And as things go during hypes, there's also some misinformation provided by people who have a vested interest to play a little bit fast and loose with the truth. And we want to set the record straight with this seminar. So we're going to assume that by now most of you kind of know how generative AI works, but let's quickly recap a few of the important factors that you perhaps do not always realize as such. What is very fascinating for me is that generative AI kind of functions like humans do, and actually it works in many aspects a lot more like the human brain than it would resemble traditional information technology. Generative AI works with associations between data points, similar to the neurons in our brains. For example, ask generative AI the same question twice, and then even if it has exactly the same input, it will usually not give you exactly the same answer. You can get wildly different answers depending on the surrounding context. Context is everything, similar to how humans can be in a very different mood depending on when you ask them something on a certain day. You must also be careful not to ask too much or not to give too much context to certain LLMs because they have limited memories and limited attention span. Maybe a bit similar to how humans are, and maybe particularly teenagers, like give them too much information and the task that they're about to execute will be hampered by it. And it is this human-like thinking power that enables the large language models to handle language, which is something very vague sometimes, very, very ambiguous, and something that needs to be creatively handled. And that's something that LLMs are really good at. But at the same time, there are also some fundamental limitations of the technology, and that's where we focus a lot of attention on during this webinar. So hallucinations, that's one of these things that has been a key point of attention as from the beginning, as from the start that the LLMs were entering the market. Like humans, LLMs sometimes misremember or even just make up things out of thin air via the associations that they have in their digital neurons. As you may have seen, there are quite some lawyers who have already been caught using ChatGPT in their legal briefs. For example, referring to case law that was completely fabricated. Probably the biggest story of 2024 on this topic was Stanford University's research into hallucinations in Gen AI, and particularly Thomson Reuters Westlaw and LexisPlus AI by LexisNexis. This was a wildly controversial story back when it came out earlier this year. In short, Stanford published a report on hallucination in these tools, and then Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis naturally protested the findings. Stanford then published an augmented report where it still arrived at the numbers that you're seeing on the screen right now. Less than half of Westlaw's responses were correct, and in 1 out of 3 cases, it hallucinated. Lexis Plus performed a little bit better, but still not quite satisfactory. We're highlighting this because it's important to keep in the back of your mind. And big companies like Westlaw, like Lexis Plus, with all their resources, cannot manage to get the hallucination problem under control. That's not stopping a lot of legal tech vendors from claiming that they have this problem solved, but it serves to be skeptical when you're hearing about these claims about 99% accuracy and so on. All treat it with a grain of salt. Context windows, that's another crucial limitation to understand. What is it about? Well, it's the amount of text that you can give to an LLM. It's the amount of data that the LLM can take into account when it generates a response or analyzes your question. A bit like the human brain that can overload it. Well, the LLM can store terabytes of background information in the back of its mind, so to say. But when it has to read a custom text, when you ask it a question, when you give it a contract that it must start to analyze, it only has a limited capacity. For GPT-4, initially when it came out, this limit was around 12 pages of text. That was, of course, not enough for a lot of legal tasks. But then a special version was also available that could process more, something about 50 pages of text. And then there were competing vendors such as Anthropic that then tried to differentiate their product offerings by offering a context window of around 200 pages of text. Today, that limit is kind of becoming the standard. Many commercial LLM vendors offer this or roughly get in its neighborhood. For example, OpenAI offers something like a little bit less with GPT-4o. There is a Meta offering something similar with the Llama open source model. And Anthropic Claude, which is another LLM, even goes beyond this up to 300 pages of text. Google offers Gemini Pro with even 3,000 pages of text in the context window. That's not to say that the problem of the context window is solved, because it is somewhat linked to the attention span problem. That's different, but it is related. So what is it about? Well, scientific studies have pointed out that the quality of the large language models answers can significantly drop with large input sizes, particularly in the middle of the input text. This is known as the lost in the middle problem, where the LLM kind of falls asleep halfway and then wakes up again near the end. So it will miss information that tends to be around 50 to 80% part of the input text, where it just misses things there and gives incomplete answers when the crucial elements of the answer are found in that range of the input text. Now, it is fair to say that in the last year, the large language model vendors have really focused on this problem and tried to remediate this. But even with the best commercial LLMs today, the quality of the output does remain inversely related to the size of the input text. So it's not solved yet, but it has become a lot better. Naturally, a lot of different AI companies are experimenting with workarounds. It is a limitation. You cannot just throw thousands of pages of text into a large language model and then hope that it will give back a good answer. And so they're working on workarounds, like, for example, segmentations, like splitting input text into different pieces, and semantic search. And it's particularly that semantic search that is getting a lot of attention. It essentially means that you are pre-filtering inputs so that only the best pieces of your input are being fed into the large language model. This is a workaround that frequently works, but it also breaks down easily because it's simply not possible for every legal task to be split like this, to only select the best pieces and then hope that the answer is still correct if you haven't even seen the less important segments, because they are not fed to you as a large language model. Now, these workarounds have become a kind of standard in the sector, although many will, of course, not openly talk about this. So just be aware that large language models and a high degree of accuracy are simply not yet a really good match. So, but you could also see it from the bright side. Of course, a human expert must still remain in the loop. It is not yet the case that you can simply give every legal task to a large language model and hope that it will produce a perfect answer. We're not there yet, and we may not even get there ever. Size does matter. What is this about? Well, it is about the fact that the more data that can be put in the back of the mind of the large language model, the better that it will provide answers. So you can see here that there was some question being asked about the EU GDPR, like a very, very specific question about the facts of some article of the GDPR. Well, here you can see that in a very small large language model, one that contains only 1 billion parameters, meaning, just for comparison's sake, the large commercial vendors offer something between 300 and 500 billion parameters. But for a very small one, what happens is that the answer will, basically be pointless. The LLM almost immediately gives up because it doesn't know enough. There's not enough data in the back of its mind to actually answer the question that is being asked. Notice, however, that it does understand the question, and it does provide a grammatically correct answer in English. So that's something that it does really well with its 1 billion parameters, but the very factual aspects of the answer, it just cannot give you because it's not sufficiently powerful for that. But if we now have a look at the 8 billion version of the same large language model, then it gives you a different answer already. So it's still giving up, so it doesn't give a very useful answer, but you can see that it is actually being a lot more helpful because it understands more, because it has some more data. It points you to some direction where you may be able to find relevant information as a human being. So that's 8 times the size of the 1 billion version, and you already see that this large language model is a lot better. If we then have a look at the next version, which is the 70 billion parameter version, here you can see that it's first a lot slower. See how slow this all becomes? Why is that? Because the hardware needs to work so much harder to actually produce this, because it contains 70 times as much data to crunch through to actually come up with an answer. So you see this crawling in, but it is a good answer. And so you see that 70 times the size of the first version that I've shown you, 70 times the size, and suddenly you get a very good answer to your question. And so size does matter, and that's why the commercial large language model vendors have really focused on the size of their models, because size kind of seems to equal quality. Now, So the LLM vendors were so focused on the size that they were looking for data to actually feed into their models. But getting training data is not so simple, actually. So the large language models are trained on a vast collection of very general data. So people like to say that they are trained on the internet, on what is available on the public internet, and that's a bit reductive, but it does demonstrate the magnitude and the scale of the training data, because you really need to look around the entire internet to actually find enough data to satisfy your data hunger as a large language model. In the picture, you can see that the training data that was used for GPT-3 is really composed of what was found on the public internet back at the time, with some Wikipedia stuff, some books, some copyrighted books even. If we then have a look at GPT-4, yeah, we cannot give an answer, or one of the other commercial vendors, because they do not disclose the exact composition of their data. Probably they also rely at least partially on what it is, on what GPT-3 was doing, because that data set was kind of public. But we don't know exactly how big their data size is. We don't know exactly how they train this, and so on. So that's still an open question. It's an important question because you can think of large language models like supercars. It's really a brand new engine. It's a general purpose vehicle, you could say, that can get you into very interesting places very fast. But of course, a car can only go as fast as the road allows it to go. And that's why we like to say that data is the road. So the LLM is the engine or the vehicle. The data is the road that the vehicle is traveling on. Especially for niche use cases like legal services, this is extremely important. You can have the fastest car ever built, but if all you have is a bumpy country road to drive the car on, then it won't get you very far, and it won't even get you faster anywhere than a tractor would do. So the large language models, they shine when they can be trained on large amount of data, where they read the same stuff over and over and over again, and they have to respond with well-known examples. So the prototypical environment where they really like best for their training purposes is a question answer forum. So people asking questions and then entire discussions being generated around these questions with pros, cons, people arguing in different directions and so on. That's what LLMs are really like from a training perspective, and where they really learn a lot from. If we have a look at the available data, you can see that in the last 12 months, there have been many examples where the commercial large language model vendors have been entering into partnerships. So the increasing size of the LLMs is still a hot topic, but the really competitive battle between the biggest models has now been focusing on getting better data sources. So quantity is one thing, quality is yet another thing that in the last 12 months has received a lot more attention. And why is it so important to get better data sources? Well, there were a few reasons. The first is the quality. It's following the rule of garbage in, garbage out. Large language models can only offer good quality if they are fed with these deep discussions, with well-written, deep coverage of subjects. For example, those on discussion forums or in books, scientific articles, these kinds of things. And it's therefore not surprising that what you see on the screen are partnerships with, for example, Reddit, the discussion forum, or newspapers like Financial Times, like Associated Press, Le Monde, and so on. These kinds of sources are very important because they are high quality and the LLMs can easily learn from them. The second reason why these data sources are so important is the competitive advantage. When everyone can access roughly the same public data on the internet, then a major point of differentiation you can have is with training on data that is locked behind digital paywalls and is therefore not accessible to your competitors. So the commercial LLM vendors have reached the stage where they are running out of available data on the public internet that meets the minimum quality threshold. And so accordingly, any additional data of decent quality from the partnerships that you can see on the screen is highly welcomed. Of course, access to data through these partnerships gets expensive, and building LLMs is already a loss-leading exercise. So if we go to the next slide, yeah, you can see there have been some rumors. It could very well be the case that the subscription price of the LLMs will go up in the future. We don't know, but there are rumors like this. We're seeing articles like this pop up from time to time. We believe this is OpenAI running the idea of the flagpole, as they say. They're dropping that information out in the wild to see, like, yeah, how will the market react to these kinds of price increases. Now, of course, full disclosure, the article mentions that the $2,000 is stretched over an undetermined amount of time. It could be $2,000 per month, per year, per user. We don't know exactly. The idea is these partnerships cost money. Training large language models is very expensive. Doing these partnerships is expensive. We don't know where all of this will lead. We do know that from an economical perspective, operating a large language model is very, very difficult to do cost effectively. So the third reason why that the LLM vendors are focusing on better data sources, well, is because they want to avoid litigation. As you probably know, there are a couple of high-profile lawsuits pending against the likes of OpenAI and Microsoft, Meta, and Anthropic. So several lawsuits going on. As former IT lawyers ourselves, we're very interested in where this will lead us, how this will play out. Yeah, copyright legislation was never designed to deal with these kinds of situations where copyrighted works or, yeah, basically used as fertilizers. So books being cut into little pieces, and then these little pieces are not stored as such in the memory of the large language model. And they're also accompanied by millions, if not billions, of other copyrighted works that are all mixed together into a kind of fertile ground from which then answers are being generated. Even if all of this would qualify as fair use under US copyright law, the stricter EU copyright framework, which doesn't have that level of flexibility, may really spoil the party of the LLM vendor. So we don't know how these things will play out in the US, in Europe. That's still an open question. Back to Senne, I would say, for the question on what this all means for lawyers in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Maarten. So, okay, now we have a good idea on the general state of the technology and most importantly, some of those limitations. So let's dive into the interesting practical stuff. What does all of this actually mean for lawyers? And so we've seen the technology evolve in kind of leaps and bounds over the past couple of years. GPT-3 was a huge step up from GPT-2. GPT-4 was another huge step up from GPT-3. That growth is going to continue, but we are entering a kind of plateau phase because those fundamental constraints, which Maarten talked about just now, aren't just quite resolved at this point in time. So hallucination still very much baked into the very nature of the product. It's not something that we can just kind of take out just like that, as we saw with the Stanford study. The LLMs require regular updates or retraining and things like that. Quality data, as we also discussed, getting harder and more expensive to find. You know, there's diminishing returns on all of those efforts. Right now, it's not clear whether these problems are truly solvable or not solvable with current technology, or if it will just take time. But we can already say that, you know, a GPT-7 is ultimately going to eclipse a GPT-4 in much the same way as previous generations of the technology have eclipsed each other. But it's going to take some more time to work away some of these fundamental constraints. But in the meantime, we are fully convinced that in 2025, generative AI is going to become a necessary tool in every lawyer's toolbox. We obviously get a lot of questions on how that tool can be used. So let's go through some of these questions that we receive most often. Starting with, are legal tech really creating their own LLMs? That's one that we get quite often. There's a ton of companies out there saying that they are creating these LLMs, and you may ask yourself, how can that be true when an OpenAI or an Anthropic have to raise billions of dollars to do it? And the short answer, which may surprise you, is that yes, it is true, in fact, to an extent. But let's look a little bit deeper at what creating your own LLM really means. Because there are essentially a couple of different flavors, a couple of different types of training that you can do. And you can roughly compare this, as you can see in the slide in front of you, to how children are educated. So first type of training that we see there is a semantic model. So a semantic vector model learns by basically only going to school until the age of 6 in our analogy here. But by then it has enough information to recognize many words and put them into different categories. A general LLM, a so-called foundational model, so think ChatGPT, Llama, Claude, those kinds. They go to a general school and a university, so a lot further educated. An LLM that is this fine-tuned on legal tasks, that's a word that you see quite often, right? That's something that you can compare to, taking a summer job at a law firm. So the LLM will not really learn new things there necessarily about the law, but after the summer period, it will understand better how lawyers talk and how they behave in practice. A truly legal model, so a real large language model built for the legal sector, takes a pretty different education path. So it goes to a general school, as you can see, until about the age of 12, but then switches to a kind of specific legal school. So that means that it is going to know much more about law. It's going to be much better suited towards law, but it's going to miss out on all of that sort of general knowledge that you can expect from those foundational models. It's going to understand, to stay within the analogy, it's going to understand less about subjects like biology, music, politics, all of that kind of stuff. A good analogy that we also like to make is, these legal models will not be able to do quirky things like, draft a legal opinion and sprinkle in a couple of Taylor Swift quotes or anything like that. But it is going to have a much better understanding of those legal principles. But so back to the question of whether it is possible for legal tech vendors to create their own model. So building a foundational model, right? Like, again, OpenAI's GPT, Anthropic's Claude, et cetera, that will still be reserved for these huge behemoth companies with extremely deep pockets, because training them still requires billions per year. So that's the foundational models. Remember, in the analogy, someone needs to pay for those 20 plus years of education. But a lot of companies that claim that they built their own model, what essentially happening there is that they are fine-tuning those foundational models that have already had their general training. So essentially, there's a small layer of behavior that gets added on top of those foundational models, so that they know better how to behave in a legal setting. Again, that's the law firm intern analogy that we made just now. But fine-tuned models also have a big downside, because they will sometimes overreact in their new behavior, as if our summer law firm student starts talking legalese in their friend group when it's not quite as appropriate. A good example of where fine-tuning can go wrong is with Google Gemini's attempts to combat generative AI's history of amplifying racial stereotypes. So some of you may have seen this news come out in the course of this year still. In short, we can summarize as follows. Generative AI is quite prone to display white people when you ask it to generate a specific image and you don't specify skin color and things like that. And so Google, in its Gemini model, tried to install some guardrails in its image generation to prevent this. So that's that fine tuning. Now the result, of course, is that the output that was produced is simply not accurate. So to come back to the topic of training your LLM, so to our knowledge, there are really only a handful of companies who are really building models from scratch in the legal space. And here we want to give a special shout out to Noxtua, which is an LLM built by a company called Zane. For anyone who reads our newsletter or follows us on LinkedIn, you may have seen that we recently partnered with them. And they are a great example of a large language model that was deliberately trained for the legal sector, for legal work. And unlike also most US-based providers, because let's face it, most of these LLM companies, AI companies are US-based, they were also built with a lot of European compliance legislation in mind. We have not yet reached a stage where it is commercially viable for to offer really highly specialized large language models for small markets. So like a French M&A law or a Spanish tax law large language model. We're not quite there yet, but we do expect that those LLMs will be offered in about 2 to 3 years when hardware costs have dropped further, and also when legal publishers who contain a lot of this data that those large language models would need, when they have caught up with some of these novel techniques for building large language models. So another important question that we do frequently receive is, can I create my own LLM? And so initially, right, LLMs promise to solve the knowledge management problem that everyone is aware of and struggling with. The idea that you have to basically share that knowledge, build that up internally, but that's manual, that's boring, that's time consuming, and there's this instinctive kind of need or this instinctive kind of assumption that a robot should be able to do all of that for you. By now, though, we know that that is kind of a pipe dream. The first problem is you don't have enough data to train your LLM. Your case management system, your document management system, whatever you want to call it, it will be full of emails, contracts, disputes, all that kind of thing, all those different kinds of things. But only a limited part is written by you and is not outdated. So theoretically, you could add that data to a foundational model, but it's still just way too limited. And you'll have to really clean and curate in order to make it work. And probably then it's still not even going to be enough. I mean, you're adding a few drops of your data in what is essentially an ocean underlying, an ocean of underlying data that you then start from that foundational model. And you would also have to retrain that data every year or so, and it will cost you more than €1 million or dollars in training costs and expertise and things like that. And that's not something that we have seen a lot of law firms feel is worth the investment. So another question, can LLMs be used to assess compliance with specific laws? This is obviously a really popular one as well. We do get that question quite often. In fact, what you're seeing here on the screen is exactly an anonymized screenshot, of course, from a question that we literally received from a potential client who was interested in knowing if our tool could ensure compliance with Italian law, that kind of thing. To answer that question, basically, we have to say that in the legal sector, data shortage remains an incredibly big problem, and it's hampering really the widespread uptake of large language models. In most scientific sectors, data can be applied pretty much worldwide. So imagine, you have a large language model that is trained on X-rays in the field of medicine. X-rays are not limited by jurisdictions and things like that. They're equally valid in Australia as they are in Spain. But in the legal sector, we are much more fragmented into separate jurisdictions with also the language barrier. So that for most legal tasks, it's not a good idea to mix data from different jurisdictions. And even more problematic is also the confidentiality issue, which causes that most interesting data remains behind digital bars of companies, of law firms, think legal publishers and things like that. To solve that problem, to solve the full problem of developing an LLM that could guarantee kind of like a legal compliance check, an LLM vendor would not only have to strike costly partnership deals with international law firms, but would also probably have to create separate large language models for separate jurisdictions, and that just causes training costs to explode. You're not creating a single product that can service a global market. You're creating tons of different tiny products that can serve tons of different tiny markets. So a couple of expectations on our part. We expect that some legal LLMs can be published for those larger jurisdictions, particularly those focused on case law. So I think common law, US, UK, those are the obvious candidates here. And a few major legal publishers will start creating large language models for their legal doctrine. And that can work even under the current constraints, but with, of course, all those caveats that we just talked about in the back of our mind. Another very popular one, can AI draft entire documents? For any of you who have given large language models enough of a try already, you won't be surprised to hear that the answer is obviously yes. I'm sure many of you currently listening have undoubtedly already tried to actually get a simple chat GPT, to generate a full document for you, an NDA or something simple like that. And you've probably also experienced good results with it. So does that mean that an LLM can draft entire documents? Well, it depends. We've talked about context windows, right, as one of those major challenges in the sort of abstract lay of the land of the technology. And so when we focused on those context windows, we talked about how much you can put into the LLM, how much it can take in from that outside prompt. What we haven't looked at is how much the AI can get out back to you. And most people don't realize that in practice, the output of many commercial large language models maxes out at about 6 pages of text. So even Google's Gemini Pro, which again, as you will remember, can handle a whopping 3,000 pages of input, so huge context window. Gemini Pro's output is capped at 12 pages. So 3,000 pages of input versus 12 pages of output. That's obviously a bit of an issue. This past summer, OpenAI did introduce an experimental model called GPT-4 long output, very creatively, which expands that limit by around 16 times. Very exciting technology, but there is a catch. It is significantly more expensive, and as of now, the access to it is still pretty restricted. So we don't really have personal experience with being able to say how well it works or what some of the hangups may be. You may ask yourself, why do these limitations exist? Well, it boils down to hardware, essentially. Both input and output size require exponential increases in computing power. Essentially, every time you double the input or output size, the hardware requirements for that quadruple. So it's a case of diminishing returns, that kind of stuff. It's an unsolved problem. Now, you've probably seen vendors, or you've probably talked to vendors who do offer full document drafting as a kind of feature. For those of us who are developing large language model based tools, we can work around these restrictions, but it's not often all that pretty. So if a document doesn't have much overlap or a lot of interdependency between the different parts, the solution is fairly straightforward. I mean, you just ask the model to generate one section at a time that's still within that output limit, right, that we talked about. But here's where it gets tricky. A lot of legal documents, especially contracts, are tightly interconnected. As you can also see on the screen here, we've got cross-references that link to different parts of a document. We've got defined terms that need to stay consistent across different documents. And those classic legal structures where general principles in one section tie into detailed carve-outs in many pages later, right? We also see that with traditional document automation, where you can have some of these questions where you have 3 options to select what type of document you're drafting and then just selecting one of those three options changes parts across an entire document. That's also, again, a good example of that interconnectivity, interdependency. And so what you have to do with those types of documents is you're building really fragile kind of orchestration layers to piece everything together to make sure that every single chunk is taking into account what all the other chunks are saying. It's a workaround that can do the job, but honestly, it's not exactly elegant. It's not ideal. It's kind of a duct tape equivalent to making a neat whole of everything. So not really ideal. Moving on, another very important question that we do often get, especially with prospective clients who are just dipping their toes in the water, just trying to kind of see a little bit, okay, you know, what's out there, what is some of the technology capable of. One of the first questions that they will ask is, you know, what sort of measures are you taking? What sort of security constraints do you have in place to ensure that my data is not being used to train the model? And actually, the question can be asked, you know, is your data even being used at all to train the model? The premise is very enticing, right? From the perspective of those LLM vendors, the premise is very enticing. We talked about the challenge of accessing quality data, and the fact that OpenAI, for example, is going into all of these highly expensive content partnerships with some of these very large companies. So you could also ask the question, right? Instead of spending all of that money trying to get that quality content in place, wouldn't it just be better if you use all of the content that your users are providing to you for free in the form of their inputs? Right? That's a common and a fair assumption. It would. I mean, there's tons of inputs being submitted to tools like ChatGPT every single day. So that is indeed a valid concern if you would want to use those models for the more confidential stuff that you're working with. Now, different companies deal with this problem in different ways, but there is a trend to be seen. And you've probably all heard of the saying, if the product is free, then you are the product. That seems to be what's happening here. So most of the major models either train on your data if you just use the chat function in the free version, but don't in the API version of the product. So that's a clear dividing line that we can see. So for example, if you use a legal tech tool, like for example, ClauseBase's own ClauseBuddy, that integrates with one of these models through that API integration, then your data is not being used to train the model with most of the commercial models that you're seeing, most of those foundation models that you're seeing on the screen here. One exception is the fact that your prompts may be stored for abuse monitoring. In other words, if you were to use, again, a tool like ClauseBuddy to ask for instructions on how to make a bomb, then your prompt is probably going to get caught by the sort of content control reviewing tool. That's for a lot of these cloud services, that's pretty much standard fare. We know that this shook up the legal industry a couple of months ago pretty significantly. But honestly, it really shouldn't be all that surprising, to be honest. You'll probably have also seen a couple of AI vendors who claim to use all kinds of filters and anonymization tools to protect you against those bad LLM, the naughty LLM vendors that are out after out to get your data. That might have been a realistic threat back in 2023, but honestly, this is pretty much a solved issue. And especially, again, if you're using legal tech tools that are implementing these foundational models, then you really don't have anything to worry about on the topic of your data being reused to train larger language models, rather. Now we're getting into a little bit more of an existential question, but also a very popular one among lawyers. There's a lot of fear mongering, right? A lot of people saying that AI is coming for lawyers. Is there any truth to it? If you are at all active on LinkedIn, or if you've just been following generative AI in the legal sector for a while, you'll probably be sick of this cliche by now. I know I am, but there is definitely a kind of kernel of truth to it. So lawyers are expected to be able to use the tools of their trade, and honestly, generative AI is just rapidly becoming such a tool. And for many lawyers, it's already an unmissable part of their toolbox. I think it's a little bit reductive, though. I mean, in the current climate, lawyers are not being replaced solely because of how well they use AI. That may be the case, several years down the line, but especially law firms, right? Let's take those as an example. Clients come to law firms because of their prestige, their reputation, because of the trust that they kind of exude. Clients are not going to seek out another law firm because their current law firm doesn't run all their questions through ChatGPT. The topic is just, or the concerns are just a lot different. So that's not really relevant right now. But on top of that, just want to add that, based on all of those limitations that we just discussed, AI is still just simply much better suited to a role of assistant rather than as a replacement. That said, in a webinar where we are discussing the evolution of generative AI, we would be wrong to not review AI agents. So you've probably heard about this. In short, AI agents, or agentic AI as it's sometimes called, describes the phenomenon where large language models and other software components work together to execute a complex task without any human oversight. So let's take a quick example here. Suppose you use ChatGPT to prepare for your upcoming trip. The LLM will give you a bunch of good suggestions on how to get there, where to stay, what to do, et cetera, but it's still up to you to book all of those tickets and to actually make the necessary preparations. If we repeat that process, but with the help of agents, we could, in theory, submit the same query, but now the agent would interface with a tool like booking.com to book your stay, with a tool like Skyscanner to book your flights. It would prepare all of your reservations to all of the restaurants you'll be eating at. It will book any tickets to museums and things like that, all without your further action being necessary, without your oversight being necessary. Now, of course, our audience today is mostly lawyers, so maybe booking a vacation isn't a very relatable example. Let's instead take the example of legal research. So traditionally, right, a human lawyer would search in a database when they receive a legal question that they need to answer. They would search in a database for relevant case law, for relevant legislation, for relevant legal doctrine, et cetera, analyze the results, perform some additional searches, and ultimately kind of pool all of that information together to write a memo about the findings. In an agentic system, those software components will just replace the human. So asking the LLM to formulate queries, analyze the results, all of those different things, even writing the memo itself, right? That is something that in theory could be handed over to agents. Now we're using the matrix analogies, and obviously Agent Smith is the bad guy, but we do really believe that agents are the future. I mean, there's a lot of potential there, but of course, all of the limitations that we discussed, or that Maarten discussed in the first half, still apply. So the quality of an agent depends on the quality of the LLM powering it, and there we run into those problems with hallucination, and that hallucination problem can actually be compounded, because if agents are acting in a sequence, and one of those agents in a sequence starts making errors, starts hallucinating, then those agents in the other parts of the sequence, they're relying on faulty inputs to do their work. So that's a big hurdle, and then of course the limited context window, the publicly available data, all of that is still quite a bit of a challenge. But there's also just the issue of third-party services, right? Again, agents would be large language models interacting with other software components, and in order to be able to do that, those third-party services will need to have the necessary infrastructure in place to allow those kinds of interactions. Barring that, so where there's no kind of where there's no offer of server-to-server interactions, in theory, you could have tools where the AI kind of browses these websites or these services and kind of looks at them in the way that a human would. Anthropic actually recently started offering a tool called computer use, or a feature called computer use, which basically allows the AI to see your screen through the help of screenshots and things like that, and to interact with it as if it were a human user. If you see the video on computer use, you can see that the technology is still very much in its infancy, but we have no doubt that that is going to get better with time. So, Maarten, handing things off back to you.
Yep, thank you. So to finish the presentation, yeah, let's go for something positive as well. We have been somewhat negative in the past hour. But despite all of the healthy skepticism that we have raised, we are actually really, truly convinced that generative AI is the future and will be part of every lawyer's legal toolkit. Popular use cases that you can see here on the screen, if we take into account all of the limitations that currently exist, that we've discussed during the past hour, there actually remain quite a good, solid number of use cases that do make for an instant impact, some low-hanging fruit. In fact, we've built quite a few of them ourselves in our own Microsoft Word add-in ClauseBuddy. And with a few minutes left, let's take a look at the examples that we can give you. So summarization, that's actually a very good one. We know that large language models are supremely good at summarization. Research indicates that humans even prefer summaries of robots, of the large language models, than the ones created by humans. In the video, you can see here that ClauseBuddy's summarization module allows you to select some text, and this is some contract that you select, and you could say, for example, get me a list of all the noteworthy contractual obligations that are inside of the clauses. So it just takes just a couple of seconds, and boom, you have your summary available. We can now do things like, for example, pull out entire clause by clause summaries of a document, creating drafting reports, creating reports for your C-level management, and so on. These things just are established, they're good, they work really, really well. Reviewing documents, another killer task. We actually launched a tool for reviewing and markup early 2023 to test this. Back at the time, the performance was a bit shady, but then, over time, with the upgrade of the large language models and renewed approaches from our side, where we try to focus more on what issues the large language model needed to check on. Right now, the results are much better and really usable. Not perfect, but really, really usable by a lot of lawyers. So you actually give it a handful of requirements that it needs to look at. It takes your input text and then does the cross-check of which rules are met, which rules are not met, and you can even immediately adapt your text in accordance with your specifications. So reviewing documents, that's something really for the legal toolbox of every lawyer. Drafting and redrafting. Large language models are very useful for receiving drafting inspiration, especially when useful precedent clauses are hard to find, or when a useful precedent clause needs to be tweaked, for example. Most legal teams that develop policies around large language models explicitly state in these policies that you can only use the large language model for areas that you're already an expert in, so you can accurately verify its output. Additionally, the LLMs are surprisingly useful for negotiations. Explaining to the large language model what compromise the parties have reached and how to actually put that oral agreement into the actual text is something that the LLMs are really good at, as you can see here in the video. So that's about it. We have a couple of questions that were asked during the past minutes. One that was raised here that I wanted to answer is like, essentially, do you think lawyers are interested in this topic of Gen AI? Are they interested in this very webinar because it's an opportunity for lawyers, or is it perhaps more of a fear that lawyers fear for their job? So we've already talked a bit about that job loss fear. There's certainly an element to it. We don't know what the future will bring exactly. What we find fascinating during demos, for example, is that we frequently get the question of a legal team having a look at our product, at other products, and then asking the question like, can it, for example, synthesize, take 20 of my best share purchase agreements and combine them into one share purchase agreement that combines the best of all the other ones. So a very, very complex task, where we then, for example, say, yeah, that's not yet really possible, and then we see it in the eyes of the legal professionals on the other side, that they are a bit disappointed, that they're like, no, I would have really hoped that I wouldn't have to manually do this work. Why can't the LLM do it? We can put people on the moon. ChatGPT can be so creative, but apparently it cannot combine all these things for me and do it in my own, instead of me doing it on myself. But at the same time, when we then say, you should be happy with this, perhaps, because the really difficult tasks, that's something where still all your years of experience and your human judgment are necessary. And that's something, yeah, be happy that the machine is not taking over. And then you see another sparkle in the eyes of the audience, where they're like, yeah, maybe that's a good thing. So it's still a bit of a mixed bag. We don't think that the lawyers will be taken over by robots. But it will become part of your legal toolbox, just like Googling is a part of your legal toolbox, using word processors, Outlook, and so on.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Maarten. We also have another question here. So the API version of these tools doesn't train on your data, but it does constitute sending personal data though, right? How do organizations deal with that under GDPR? And so indeed, if we go quickly back to our popular use cases, or rather, sorry, no, I need to go to a different slide here. Yeah, no, okay. So indeed, the personal data issue. So we talked a little bit about how the training on your own data isn't as much of a problem as a lot of people may think, or whether this is something that is basically, a lot of companies are maybe making a bigger deal out of this than it really is. But indeed, there are two elements to the data that is being sent to these LLM providers when you are interacting with it. On the one hand, or there's two concerns basically that you can have. On the one hand, there is indeed confidentiality, right? Is my data being used? And to that's mostly a solved problem, like we explained. But there's also the element of just GDPR in general. And there's a lot of compliance, there's a lot of personal data in these inputs that you're sending to large language models. And that is something that indeed you have to take into account. And there, the traditional GDPR rules also apply. You're mostly working with US-based providers if you're working with a tool like this. So, especially if you are subject to the GDPR, that is something that you do have to take into account. And so all of the traditional transfer mechanisms, like standard contractual clauses, all of those different mechanisms, they do apply. But that is also kind of a problem that is also mostly solved in the sense that the way that you deal with data transfers to the OS for any other of the services that you use, that is how you deal with that in this case as well. But I will say, indeed, on that GDPR topic, there are a lot of vendors that are kind of taking that and using it as a differentiation. So you already know Mistral, which is a French company which launched kind of under that umbrella of under that sort of enthusiasm of, oh, we have a European large language AI company, a large language model developer. That was very good for their brand and their image and things like that. And they're actually still using that in their branding by calling it La Plateforme, their tool, for example. And then also, of course, Noxtua, right, that we talked about. Also, again, another tool that was developed specifically with those compliance considerations in mind.
Yep. Maybe to finish off, there is another question here about on the popular use case slide. You said that chatting with your document management system is not a good use case. Why? So that's the gut feeling of a lot of law firms, of in-house legal teams. Like, we have terabytes of data available from past cases that we worked on. It contains knowledge. Why can't we use that knowledge? Why can't we have the robot go through it and filter all of that? Well, the problem is that it's difficult to differentiate. If you the large language model, if it can process terabytes upon terabytes of data, it will kind of balance the good with the bad. It will notice after a while that outdated information, for example, that it got replaced by newer data, like old case law gets replaced by new case law. So if you have an ocean of data, these things kind of balance each other out. And an LLM, if it would have an ocean of data, it would work, leaving aside the cost, of course, of the millions of training that you would have to go through each year. Problem is, you don't have this amount of data. You only have a limited amount of data in your document management system. And so you will end up with a lot of noise. And this noise versus signal ratio will be very bad, up to the point that it will be unusable for you to actually do that. So there are some workarounds. You can have that semantic search that searches in your database. You can have if you properly screen your data, you can get quite far. But still, that idea of let's be lazy, let's just assume that the machine can do everything that we haven't been doing ourselves in all these years in terms of knowledge management, it's a pity, but that's not going to work.
Okay, now we have reached the time. So it's 5 p.m. now here in Central Europe. We had one final question, by the way, and that was what is the pricing of your tool? And so for that, if anyone's interested, we publicly publish that on our website. So if you go to clausebase.com, you can see everything on our pricing page. But with all of that said, I want to thank you all for being here, for taking the time. The recording is going to come straight to you right after this webinar wraps up. But if you have any other questions in the meantime, you're welcome to reach out to us. You can find us on LinkedIn most easily, and then we can take it from there. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.